I've been a delivery driver for a construction materials company for many years, and my job often takes me through the remote rural areas of the western United States. Long, desolate roads are nothing new to me, but there was one nighttime trip through Nevada that I will never forget. It was a chilly autumn night, and I was on my way back after a delivery to a small town near the Utah border. That night, the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, with only the occasional distant headlights from other vehicles. I had been driving for hours, and although I was used to the solitude of these roads, something about this night made me feel uneasy. A few miles back, I had noticed a small pickup truck on the side of the road. It looked broken down, and I saw that its rear right tire seemed to be flat. However, I didn't stop to check, thinking they had probably called for roadside assistance. As I continued driving along a narrow, dark road, I came across an old SUV parked next to an abandoned barn. In the glow of my headlights, I saw a man lying on the ground, struggling with something behind the vehicle. From a distance, I couldn't tell if he was changing a tire or not, but the sight reminded me of the pickup truck I had passed earlier. This time, I decided to stop and turn back to check. I pulled into a small lane to turn my truck around and drove back toward the SUV. However, before I could reach it, the SUV sped past me at high speed, as if the driver was trying to get away. A sense of dread washed over me, but I still decided to go back to the spot where I had first seen the SUV. When I arrived, my headlights illuminated a strange sighted figure lying motionless in the snow. My heart raced as I stopped the truck and stepped out to take a closer look. As I approached, I realized it was a woman. She was curled up on the ground, wearing a thin, torn black dress that was smeared with mud. Her hair was disheveled and soaking wet, her eyes red from crying, and around her neck were dark bruises, as if someone had choked her. Her lips were bleeding, and she was trembling in the cold. Without thinking, I helped her up and guided her into the warmth of my truck. I turned on the heater and handed her my jacket. She stayed silent, her eyes filled with fear and emptiness. After giving her a bottle of water, I immediately called 911 to report the situation. While waiting for the police, she began to shiver and whispered a few words, but they were too faint for me to hear clearly. The only thing I caught was, "He'll come back." Her voice was weak, as though terrified that something terrible was about to happen. My heart pounded, and the unease within me grew as I wondered who this he she was referring to might be. It took nearly 20 minutes for the police to arrive. During that time, she just sat in the truck silently, not saying another word. When the officers got there, they asked me to step outside and explain what had happened. They checked on her and asked if she needed an ambulance, but she refused. She didn't want to say much to the police, but when they spoke to her, she glanced at me and quietly thanked me for coming back to help. The police took my statement and examined the area. I told them about seeing the SUV and the man struggling with something before it sped off. I had no idea what had happened to her, but it was clear she had been attacked or pulled into some frightening situation. The officers asked her a few questions, but she didn't reveal much. They helped her into the police car and drove away, while I stood there, watching until the flashing lights of the police car disappeared into the darkness. In the weeks that followed, I scoured local news sites and kept an eye on every article that might be related, but there was no news about the incident. The story seemed to vanish, just like the way the SUV had disappeared into the night. It was the first, and perhaps the last, time I faced something that left me feeling so utterly helpless. The Nevada desert night was full of mystery and terror. And one thing I knew for certain: there are things lurking in the darkness that we may never fully understand. I've been a delivery truck driver for nearly a decade, traveling through many remote parts of the United States. My job is to transport agricultural equipment to farms scattered across the country. One of the trips that has stayed with me happened on a dark night in Oklahoma. It was a vast, flat land where the fields stretched to the horizon, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything. That night, I was driving down a desolate state road, trying to complete the delivery before dawn. My 26-foot truck was loaded with heavy machinery, bound for a farm miles away from the nearest town. It was a completely remote place, with no streetlights and no signs of life apart from the sound of the wind howling through the dry grasslands. I had been driving for hours, exhausted after a long day on the road. But everything was going smoothly until I heard a rattling noise coming from the engine. My heart sank. The truck started acting up, and all the warning lights on the dashboard suddenly lit up. Before I could react, the truck stalled and came to a complete stop in the middle of the dark road. I pulled over to the side, trying to restart the engine multiple times, but nothing worked. My phone had no signal, leaving me unable to call for help. I turned off everything to conserve the battery and sat in the dark, with only the faint glow of the hazard lights. The wind picked up, pounding against the truck's cabin and carrying eerie, haunting sounds. Looking out the windshield, I had the unsettling feeling that something was moving out there, just beyond the reach of the truck's lights. At first, I thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on me, but then the movement became clearer. A shadowy figure flickered in and out of the darkness, just at the edge of my vision. Suddenly, a loud thud hit the side of the truck, making me jump. The entire vehicle shook, as if someone or something had slammed into it. My heart raced. I turned on the headlights to scan the area, but there was nothing in sight, just the vast, empty grasslands. Then another loud noise came from behind the truck. I turned to look through the rearview mirror, but saw nothing except thick darkness. An uneasy feeling crept over me, and I decided to stay put, locking the doors and waiting. The wind howled even stronger, and through the gusts, I heard a strange noise like the sound of footsteps dragging across the ground. I held my breath, afraid to move. Suddenly, a bright beam of light flashed in my rearview mirror. It was the headlights of another truck approaching from a distance. Relief washed over me, thinking that maybe another driver could help me out. The truck slowed to a stop directly in front of me. Its headlights were blinding, making it hard to see. I couldn't make out the driver, but something about the vehicle made me uneasy. The lights stayed on, nobody stepped out, and there were no signs that the driver was going to offer assistance. I started to feel suspicious. I decided not to step out of the truck. After a few minutes, the truck in front of me suddenly turned off its headlights, and darkness consumed everything once again. I sat still, the sense of unease growing stronger with each passing moment. Then, another loud thud echoed from the back of my truck. This time, I was sure that something was following me. A faint scratching sound came from the rear door, as if someone or something was trying to find a way inside. I gathered all my courage and honked the horn, hoping to scare off whatever was bothering me. But the noise only lasted for a few seconds before stopping again. I felt as though I was trapped between reality and a nightmare. Suddenly, the light in front of me came back on. The other truck switched its headlights on again, this time even brighter, as if trying to blind me. A cold wind howled, shaking the truck's cabin. I tried to check my phone, but there was still no signal. Time dragged on slowly, and all I could do was sit there, waiting for something terrible to happen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the truck in front of me began to move. It passed by slowly, revealing no sign of the driver or any indication that it ever intended to stop and help. I sat there for a long time, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. After I was certain the truck had gone far enough, I decided to step out and inspect my own vehicle. Stepping into the pitch-black night, I felt the biting cold wind cut through my skin. I walked round to the back of the truck and, to my horror, noticed deep scratch marks on the rear door long. Jagged scratches, as if something had tried to open the door from the outside. I didn't dare stay any longer. I hurried back into the truck, locked the doors, and waited for the mechanic to arrive. When daylight finally broke, they showed up at last. The mechanic checked my truck, fixed the engine, and got it running again. But when I asked him about the scratch marks, he simply shrugged and said it was probably from branches or bushes. But I knew better. Those scratches couldn't have been made by branches, and the loud thud against the side of the truck definitely wasn't caused by the wind. I don't know exactly what happened that night out on the Oklahoma plains, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never stop in a remote place at night again. Whatever lurks in the darkness, sometimes it's best left undisturbed. I work for a frozen food supply company, frequently driving trucks through the remote areas of the United States. There was one memorable trip that happened on a summer night in the Texas Panhandle, a place where there's nothing but vast fields, not a tree or house in sight. This trip turned an ordinary night into a nightmare I will never forget. That day, I was transporting a shipment of frozen food to a cold storage facility in northern New Mexico. The cargo was crucial and had to be delivered before dawn to avoid spoilage. By the time I began my journey, night had already fallen. I drove down desolate roads that stretched for miles, with not a soul in sight. The Texas Panhandle is the kind of place where you can see the road ahead for miles. And that night, aside from the headlights of my truck, everything was swallowed by pitch-black darkness. Around 1 a.m., fatigue started creeping in. I was used to the drowsiness that comes with long-distance driving, so I tried to stay awake by turning up the radio and rolling down the windows to let the breeze hit me. The isolation of the road lulled my mind into a hazy state, but I wasn't too bothered by it. I'd experienced this sensation many times before. Then, off in the distance, I noticed something strange blocking the road about half a mile ahead. My headlights illuminated something long, stretched across my lane. At first, I thought it was a blown tire or some sort of debris, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a tire. Two figures lay in a straight line, head to-toe, completely covering my lane. My heart raced as I realized this wasn't an accident. They were lying there, motionless, with no sign of movement. I quickly swerved into the opposite lane, managing to avoid them safely. After passing the two figures, I stopped my truck further down the road, but they still didn't move. My first instinct was to stop and check if they needed help, but just as my hand hovered near the door, a vague memory flashed in my mind. A former colleague, retired after years of long-haul driving, had once told me about a trick that criminals in remote areas often use. They would pretend to be injured or lie motionless in the middle of the road to lure truck drivers into stopping. Once the driver got out to check, these people, along with their accomplices hiding nearby, would ambush, rob, and sometimes leave the driver in a dire situation. His warning echoed in my mind like a red flag. I decided not to stop. As I put the truck in gear and started to drive away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw both figures suddenly stand up. My heart sank. They were no longer motionless. Both of them stood up quickly and stepped back into the darkness. vanishing into the night sky. A wave of fear washed over me, but I knew I had to keep driving. I grabbed my phone and called the police, reporting what had happened. As I explained the situation, I knew it would take them hours to get to such a remote area, and by the time they arrived, there would likely be no trace of anything. After the call, I continued my journey, but the feeling of unease wouldn't let go of me. My mind kept replaying the image of those two people standing up from the road as if they had planned everything. I couldn't shake that eerie image, and suddenly everything around me felt more ominous. Not long after, I started hearing strange noises coming from the back of the truck. At first, it was just light tapping sounds, as if someone was knocking on the back of the truck. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or the frozen goods inside shifting. But then the knocking grew louder, becoming rhythmic, like someone was actually trying to open the trailer. I glanced into my rearview mirror, but saw nothing except darkness. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, and I didn't dare stop on such a desolate stretch of highway. The noise continued, as if something was chasing me from behind. As I tried not to panic, I suddenly saw a shadowy figure dart past the edge of my headlights. A large, blurry shape moving so fast I couldn't make out what it was. It didn't look human, but it didn't resemble any animal I had ever seen either. That shadow moved as if it was chasing my truck, weaving through the roadside brush. I pressed the gas pedal, trying to accelerate and escape the fear that was clinging to me. But the shadow was still there, closely following the truck. My heart pounded, sweat beading on my forehead. I tried to stay calm, but that eerie presence wouldn't leave me alone. Finally, when I spotted the lights of a distant gas station, I decided to head straight for it. As I reached the lit area, I looked back through the rearview mirror. The shadow was gone. There was no sign of the strange creature, and everything went quiet again. I stopped at the gas station, got out, and checked the truck. The trailer was intact, but the sounds I had heard still echoed in my mind. I inspected the area around the truck, but found no signs of anything unusual. It seemed like everything had only existed in my head, but I knew I couldn't have imagined those rhythmic knocks. As the sun began to rise, I continued my journey to the cold storage facility in New Mexico. Even though I arrived safely, my mind couldn't shake the lingering anxiety. That shadowy figure and the two people lying in the middle of the road late at night haunted me. I never found out who they were or what that mysterious creature was. But from that moment on, I became more cautious every time I drove through remote areas at night. What I experienced on the Texas Panhandle forever changed the way I viewed the solitude of long, empty roads. I've been driving long-haul trucks for nearly 10 years, delivering frozen food to restaurants and small stores in remote towns. The job demands patience and time, but I've always loved the sense of freedom that comes with cruising along America's quiet roads. However, one trip along a Colorado highway changed the way I view lonely nights on the road. It was a night in October when temperatures dropped sharply and the distant mountains appeared ghostly under the faint moonlight. I had just completed a delivery in Utah and was on my way back to Denver. The drive was long, and I knew it would take several hours of navigating winding mountain roads with no rest stops for miles. It was around 11 p.m., and I had been driving for 8 hours straight. Fatigue started creeping in, and I knew I needed to stop and rest. I'd traveled this route many times before and knew there were empty lots spaced about, 50 miles apart where truckers could safely park overnight. I found an empty lot on the side of the road, far from the treacherous rocky hills and with no houses in sight. After parking, I turned off the engine. pulled the curtains tightly across the windows, and lay down on the narrow bed behind the cab to watch a short video on my phone. The cold mountain breeze slipped through a crack in the window, carrying with it a strange chill. But the quiet of the mountains gave me a sense of calm, and after about an hour, I began to drift off to sleep. Around 1 a.m., I woke up abruptly to a strange sound. A rattling noise was coming from the driver's side door. At first, I thought it might just be the wind hitting the door handle. But when the sound repeated, I knew something or someone was trying to open the door. I sat up quickly, my heart racing and my mind spinning. I lifted the curtain just a little and peeked through the gap. The thick darkness outside made it impossible to see anything, but the rattling noise continued clearly from the other side of the truck. It sounded as if someone was trying to open the passenger door. A chill ran down my spine. The mountain road was so desolate that I hadn't heard any vehicles pass by all night. So what was trying to get into my truck? I cautiously glanced out the passenger side window, but there was no one standing there. The silence returned, but it didn't give me any sense of comfort. I decided to start the truck and turn on the headlights. The powerful beams illuminated the empty surroundings, but I didn't see anyone or anything. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to reassure myself that it was just the wind making the door rattle, but deep down I knew that wasn't the truth. I sat still in the truck, my mind racing with fearful thoughts. I pulled the curtains back and lay down, trying to ignore what had just happened. But then the noise returned, this time from the top of the truck. A faint scratching sound, as if something was trying to open the ventilation hatches on the roof. I could feel the truck shaking slightly, as if someone or something was climbing on it. I took a deep breath, summoning all my courage, and reached for the small alarm button beside the bed. The blaring alarm cut through the silence, shrill and piercing. But the strange sounds didn't stop. The scratching grew louder, with rattling noises coming from all directions. The door handles clattered again, as if someone was trying to forcefully open them. I didn't dare step outside, and I had no idea what to do. I felt trapped in a nightmare with no escape. The sounds outside the truck continued for what felt like an eternity, and then suddenly everything stopped. Complete silence. I sat there, frozen, listening to the only sound, the rapid beating of my heart. Suddenly, the headlights of another truck flashed through my rearview mirror. A large truck was approaching. The rumbling of its engine broke the eerie silence, and it passed me in an instant, leaving me with a growing sense of unease and a vague, lingering fear. For hours afterward, I sat still, my eyes glued to the windows, waiting for anything to return, but nothing came back. As dawn began to break, the faint sunlight filtering through the distant hills, I finally gathered the courage to step out of the truck and check. There was no visible damage to the truck, no signs of intrusion or tampering. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it had all been my imagination. But as I walked round to the passenger side window, my heart nearly stopped. On the glass, I saw small handprints, like those of a child. The prints were clear in the daylight, smeared with dirt and arranged in rows, as if someone had been trying to open the door. A cold chill ran down my spine. Those handprints couldn't have belonged to anyone other than the creature that had tried to get into my truck all night long. I hurried back into the cab, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. For the rest of the drive to Denver, my mind was haunted by those tiny handprints. How could a child have appeared in the freezing desert of Colorado? And why were they trying to get into my truck in the dead of night? Though I never got answers to those questions. I knew one thing for certain. From now on, I would never stop in remote areas at night again. What happened that night will forever remain a terrifying mystery that I never want to explore further. In the summer of 2001, I had just turned 19, filled with energy and a desire for freedom. With an old backpack and worn-out shoes, I decided to hitchhike from Albuquerque, New Mexico, to Tucson, Arizona. I had heard much about the majestic landscapes of the American Southwest and wanted to see the vast desert with my own eyes. However, nothing could have prepared me for what I would experience during that fateful journey. It was getting dark as I stood by the roadside, trying to wave down a ride, but no one stopped. The highway was deserted, not a soul in sight, and the sky was gradually turning into a gloomy shade of purple. The desert stretched endlessly, with only a few hot, dry winds blowing through the barren bushes. I had been standing there for over an hour without seeing a single vehicle. Anxiety started to build up inside me. Finally, when the clock was nearing midnight, an old truck appeared in the distance, its headlights illuminating a long stretch of road ahead of me. It was the only glimmer of hope I had at that moment. The truck stopped right in front of me, its lights shining directly into my eyes, forcing me to shield my face with my hand. The man stepped out of the truck. He looked old, with grey hair and wrinkled skin, wearing a worn-out leather jacket that smelled of gasoline and cigarettes. Though he didn't say much at first, his cold gaze made me a bit wary. But I didn't have many options. With the empty expanse around me and no other vehicles in sight, I knew I would have to get into this truck if I didn't want to be stranded in the desert at night. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as he opened the truck door. "Yes, thank you," I replied, and quickly climbed in. The inside of the truck was filled with the smell of old grease and cigarettes, just like its exterior. A sense of unease crept up on me, but I told myself it was just fatigue after a long day and the dim streetlights making me feel unsettled. The man didn't say much at first. He just drove, the headlights illuminating the long, seemingly endless road ahead. However, as we ventured deeper into the dark highway, he began to talk, and things started to get stranger little by little. Ever made someone so mad they wanted to slay you? He began abruptly, as if there was nothing odd about the question. I didn't know how to respond. I shook my head and tried to force a polite smile, but he didn't wait for an answer. He continued speaking, slowly, but with an undercurrent of menace. "They think I'm crazy, but I'm not," he said, his eyes still glued to the road ahead. "I took care of a guy who messed with my family. Knocked him down, not slayed, but made sure he'd remember it forever." His voice lowered, but the strange, threatening tone sent a chill down my spine. The stories he told became more disturbing with each word. He started talking about times he had to deal with people who bothered him and his family. He said he wasn't afraid of anyone, and if necessary, he wouldn't hesitate to murder someone. I sat there in silence, unsure of what to say. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong. I realized this man wasn't just a regular driver. He wasn't sticking to simple talk about life, but instead delving into thinly veiled threats that made me incredibly uneasy. There was no comfort left in this ride. Then he started talking about his son. His tone changed, from aggressive to affectionate, but that didn't make me feel any more at ease. "I love my boy more than anything. If anyone ever touches him, I'll make them pay, no matter who they are." His voice was so cold that it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know exactly what he meant, but at that moment, I felt as if I was being threatened. There we were, sitting in his dark truck, on a deserted desert road, with no one around. I realized that if he wanted to do anything to me, there would be nowhere for me to run. Suddenly, he turned fully toward me, no longer looking at the road ahead. He stared at me with wild eyes and said in a raspy voice, "If anyone hurts my boy, I'll slay them. I swear to God, I'll do it." At that moment, I knew I had to get out of that truck as soon as possible. It didn't matter how dark the night was, or that I might be stranded in the middle of the desert. All I knew was that if I stayed any longer, I might never be safe again. "Please, could you stop the truck?" I asked, trying to keep my voice as calm as possible. He looked at me for a long moment, a sinister smile spreading across his wrinkled face. "All right, kid. If you want to get out here, be my guest," he said, his voice eerily calm. He pulled over to the side of the road, and I quickly jumped out of the truck. As soon as my feet hit the ground, the massive truck roared to life and sped away, leaving me standing alone in the vast, dark desert. I stood there for a long while, my heart pounding, still reeling from the terrifying experience. The desert wind howled, kicking up dust that stung my face. There were no streetlights, no houses, only the darkness and the wind swirling around me. After a while, I found a small ditch by the roadside and decided to sit down, hoping to get some rest, but the fear still clung to me. I couldn't stop thinking about the threats that man had made, about the fury in his eyes when he spoke about his son. It felt like I had just escaped a dangerous situation that I didn't fully understand. Not long after, another truck appeared on the road. Its headlights illuminated the road ahead. The driver, this time an older man, pulled over and asked if I needed help. He had a deep, warm voice, and his wrinkled face exuded kindness. "I'll take you somewhere safe." "It's not safe out here," he said, and I didn't hesitate. I got into his truck, and the kind man drove me safely to Tucson. Along the way, he told me about his family and the grandchildren he adored. His words were like a soothing balm, helping me forget my fear for a little while. But even though I made it safely to my destination, I couldn't shake the memory of the man who picked me up first. His threatening words still haunt me whenever I think about that night. That experience taught me a valuable lesson. Not all drivers are trustworthy, and sometimes the greatest danger comes from those you least expect.